As any typical 24-year-old, I'm very independent. I have multiple chronic illnesses which disable me, so my independence looks a little different to what yours might. For example, I use a wheelchair when I'm out and about or in the house if I've got an active injury and can't walk, like a bad hip dislocation. I recently got a new wheelchair, and there's one particular feature I made sure I had, or more accurately didn't have, because of a situation that has happened to me a lot and one event that left me fighting for my life. My new chair doesn't have push handles. I've always hated when people lean on my chair or, in public, a stranger just grabs my chair by the push handles and starts trying to help me. If I needed a push, I'd have someone with me. As it is, I have a power assist application called a smart drive. My smart drive has given me my independence back, as I did used to be reliant on others to push me, but now my nifty little fifth wheel does the propelling for me, and I can roll alongside my friends, get up hills, and it generally just means I can leave the house alone. But some people see a wheelchair and assume the helpful stranger position and go in for the push. Not only is this incredibly annoying, but rude. How would you feel if you were just minding your own business crossing a road, and someone started pushing on your legs or just swung you on top of their shoulders and carried you off? Anyway, I digress. This incident happened back in 2019, so pre-pandemic times, and I was out and about doing some shopping. My old wheelchair had push handles because I hadn't started off with the smart drive, just my manual chair. But at this point, I did have my smart drive, hence me being out by myself. I also have been wearing a mask for longer than the rest of the country due to severe allergic asthma. My main triggers are industrial or environmental particles, sprays, perfumes, and cigarette smoke. So picture this, I'm outside wheeling along on my own, wearing my Vogue mask, window shopping basically, and then I wasn't. I was whizzing forward, my first thought being that I trapped my waistband accidentally, and started the smart drive up, but I very quickly realized someone was pushing me. I tried to hold my push rims to brake and turned around to tell them I'm fine, thank you. I don't need a push, and I actually have an electric box that pushes it for me. But this person just didn't care. They started laughing, a strange forced laughter, and I became more firm. Seriously, let go. I'm fine. This person didn't bat an eyelid. They didn't give a damn. They just kept pushing me and said loudly in a patronizing manner, "Yes, we're going home now." At this point, we're going pretty fast and heading in a direction I really did not want to go towards on account of it being a very industrial area where I know the traffic is bad. Buildings are being demolished for the HS2 railway and lots of people smoking at bus stops. I still have my mask on, but I start trying to reach out to strangers, shouting for someone to help me. No one did. Everyone shied away, staring wide-eyed at the crazy disabled girl in the chair and her poor carer having to rush her home with a variety of excuses. "Oh, I told you we don't grab people." "Yes, I know we're getting tired and you're overdue for meds. Let's not ruin anyone else's day." Sorry everyone." She's in a lot of pain and gets hysterical like this as he rushes me past a long line of bus stops, several smokers worth of fog beginning to penetrate my mask. Seriously, get the hell off of my chair. I need my inhaler. Let me go. We kept going and turned down a quieter street where there were literally bulldozers and wrecking balls, and the air was thick with dust. I'm getting scared. I'm wheezing. I'm really panicking now as I know we're headed out of town and I have no idea where we're going. Finally, he ends up stopping my chair, coming around in front of me, and ripping my mask off. He begins to say, "Listen, you little shit," but before he could get any further, I surprised him with a very forceful kick in the crotch. He counted on me being paralyzed, I guess, and didn't count on two things. 1, my legs working enough to defend myself, and 2, the power of panic and fight or flight when a person's throat is closing up. As he recoiled from the hard kick, I did what I've seen people do in films and brought my hands together and down onto his back as hard as I could, which I think winded him as he let out a wheeze almost as loud as my own. He dropped my mask on the floor in his panic, and whilst he was backing away, I reached around to my rucksack to grab my inhaler. I immediately took 2 puffs whilst he was cursing and screaming at me, but my ears had blocked up and my vision was going funny. A couple of the builders had seen the commotion and come over the road to see what was happening, and I pointed at the man and wheezed out, "Help, I don't know him," before I blacked out. When I came back, I was being lifted onto an ambulance gurney with paramedics and a builder around me. The man who had commandeered my chair was gone, and I had a nebulizer and oxygen blasting through a mask over my mouth and nose. I have never been so glad to take a breath. My vision was still swimming, and I felt like I'd been jabbed hard in my throat and couldn't really squeeze any words out. They loaded my chair onto the ambulance, and then we went off to the hospital. When the builders came over and I blacked out, one of them saw my inhaler, saw that my lips were blue, heard my wheezing, and immediately called 911. And the guy who'd almost killed me took off. Another builder tried to chase after him, but he didn't catch up, and the guy got away. The one who called the ambulance came with me to the hospital, and I've since become good friends with him. My family will forever credit him for saving my life that day. The police came to see me whilst I was still in hospital, and had me report what they called an attempted kidnapping. At the time, I hadn't even thought about what the outcome might have been, but once the police had talked with me, I realized how lucky I truly was. That man could have done anything to me, and if he'd picked someone who couldn't use their legs, it could have ended very differently. They spoke to the builder who chased after the kidnapper, but they were never able to catch him or even ID him. In terms of the wonderful Leroy, the police and my asthma nurse commended him on his quick thinking, and I've bubbled with his family during the pandemic. Leroy, thank you for saving my life that day, and kidnapper, let's not meet again. At 19, I was hired for the role of a correctional officer. I was one of the youngest there at the time, working at the most dangerous prison in Australia. I'd worked there for 40 years, 7 days a fortnight, 12-hour shifts. While it sounded like a pretty laid-back role, easy money really, the toll it takes on the mind is unimaginable, to the point where no money could encourage me to redo my time working there. There were good times where the men I worked with would better themselves and make something out of their lives afterwards. But I saw all manner of things, from courtyard fights to someone playing with themselves in public, to murder and people ending themselves. But none of that is what stuck with me through my time there. You would think so, but no. The one thing that stuck with me in my time there was a short-lived and supernatural experience. There was not a single drop of blood spilled during this experience, yet it was one of the most horrific and graphic things I have ever witnessed. It was a night shift. The shift started at 7 p.m. and finished at 7 a.m. We rarely did night shifts, and this was my first one since finishing training. What usually was a staff of about 200 people had dwindled down to about 30 by 10 p.m. We weren't left alone per se, but we generally did rounds on our own every hour or so. I was prepared and ready to take on the night, and being the youngest on the team and presumably the most naive, there were rounds of light-hearted teasing directed towards me. You'll have aged to 60 by the end of the night. Be aware of the night crazies, young Padawan. The start of the shift was quiet, peaceful, almost no issues, no weird bumps in the night. The inmates were quiet, dead asleep in their cells. It was probably around 4 in the morning. Tiredness was really starting to sink in when I saw a figure shift out of the corner of my eye just outside of the unit. At that point, I just brushed it off as being sleep-deprived and left to myself while the other staff members did their rounds. However, when I saw the figure move back to where it first initially moved from, my alarm bells started going off. Quietly at this point, I turned in my chair to face the windows that looked out into the courtyard and focused my eyes on where I saw the figure move to, attempting to peer through the darkness. I saw it, just a shadow, but there was something there. Now, usually if we saw something strange, we should radio it in case it was a loose inmate, but this wasn't a human figure, so I put it down to maybe being an animal, which as large as it was incredibly unlikely. This was a maximum security prison. Nothing larger than a rat should be getting in. It took my tired brain longer than it should have to process this information. The alarm bells that just moments before were a simple quiet whisper of something may be wrong were now blaring. My now fatigued mind and body were awake, every nerve burning, ready to take action. I leaned over to the control panel and flipped on the outside lights. Nothing was there, just me and my embarrassing labored breathing filling the unit. My radio cracked. My supervisor had seen the lights flipped on from the unit that she was currently doing rounds in. I had told her I thought I'd seen something moving outside, but it was most likely just my eyes playing tricks on me. She laughed back and said something that caused my skin to break out into a chilled sweat. She said to be careful of the night crazies. This is a lonely time, and the crazies are lively tonight. Really, it's a sentence that doesn't entirely make sense unless crazy was a descriptive word of someone or the name of something. I brushed it off as her and the team trying to spook the literal new kid on the block, but still, something lingered inside of me that told me that something was not right. I had half an hour of tainted peace before the next encounter with this shadow, except this time it wasn't outside. It had started as simple quiet tapping. Maybe it was the wind, but it was coming from the inside. Well then, maybe it's one of the inmates, awake and bored. During the day, the inmates would cause a muck, from tapping to banging to blood-curdling screams. The thing was, after a few minutes of thought, it was coming from one of the unoccupied C cells. I was still alone at this point, but my unit partner should have been arriving back soon after finishing their rounds. I had stared at the cell door for a few minutes trying to determine what to do when the tapping sound suddenly stopped. My previously furrowed brow softened into a picture of surprise, but mostly relief. Almost immediately after relaxing, the scraping started. A long, painful sound like someone drawing their nails across a blackboard. I cringed at the sound initially, but then panic took over. It wasn't a loud and deafening sound, but it was there. It was happening when it shouldn't have been. I wrecked my brain on what to do. Radio in, strange noise coming from unoccupied cell, going to investigate. My unit partner gave their affirmations and reported that they would only be a few more minutes, that it's probably nothing, and that I don't need to wait for them to check in on the cell. I wish they'd asked me to wait. I stood there and then walked over to the cell in a daze, not even a single hesitation. This outward confidence was at war with my insides, my heart pounding, my brain screaming for me to stop, and my lungs burning for air. My stomach was tied up in knots, and even with these warnings that something was terribly wrong behind that door, I didn't stop myself. Reaching for the latch, I opened the door. I hadn't turned on the cell light. They all turned on at the same time, and I didn't want to wake the inmates. The only light poured in from the central unit, my shape blocking most of it, letting a few dim streams through. I stepped in. I don't know why we aren't allowed to step into a cell before inspecting it, but I did it anyway. I stepped inside and into the corner to let more light in, and I saw it. It was facing away from me, a crouched humanoid figure. Its skin was a sickly green-gray color, its knees bent forward, the kneecaps facing towards me. Its limbs were long and skinny, its joints large bulbs protruding from underneath its skin. It didn't even acknowledge me. It just raised its long arms up above its head, placing the tips of its grotesque digits against the concrete wall of the cell, and ever so slowly dragged its fingers down. I'd been silent up until this point. The fingers were halfway down its path when I let out a small gasp. It paused just for a second, then it started to stand, its perverted knees cracking as it did. I was frozen. Its head was sat on a dangerously long neck that was almost the length of its demented body. It had to stoop so that its head wouldn't hit the roof. Then it started to turn, but just before I saw its face, the room went black. The door had shut, and I crumbled to the floor, screaming for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was only 30 seconds according to my partner, who ran to open the cell door. I was sent home early that day. I expected to hear something about when I went back into work, but there was nothing, not even light-hearted teasing. It was like nothing had ever happened. A few months after the event, when I'd finally settled back into a normal routine, I did some research on the prison. Many old Australian prisons had wretched pasts filled with torture. This particular prison was notorious for it back in the day: abuse, torture, hangings, and riots. I wish I had not researched the history of the prison I worked at, because up until that point, I convinced myself that I was simply sleep deprived. Although that doesn't explain the cell door closing shut and locking. For the most part, the research brought up nothing too daunting, just the typical graphic and gruesome history of Australian prisons. However, I unearthed a diary entry that was written by a man from those dark times, and one of his last entries really put the nail in the coffin for me. It stayed burned in my mind for these last 40 years. This is what his entry said. The walls we tap to make song are the same walls we scratch. Our nights are loops, and our hunger destroys our truths. They break our legs, and for daylight, we beg. Instead, they stretch out our necks with their noose. This is my first ever post on here, and I just wanted to share a couple of creepy and strange encounters in my hometown in Ontario, Canada. This first encounter that specifically haunts me to this day happened 3 years ago in the summer of 2019. I was 16 at the time. I'm a pretty big built guy, but I'm not the most confident when it comes to encountering some of the nutters you can encounter in Ontario. I was walking home from my local grocery store after going on a late night snack run, as I had plans of just gaming late with a couple of buddies that evening. This isn't a super long story, but basically, I was about halfway home when I had noticed this homeless guy on a bike that seemed to be following me. I had recognized him before. That's funny enough. About 9 months earlier, I had purchased him a coffee and a bagel during the winter months from my local Tim Horton, so I figured maybe he recognized me. I glanced back a couple of times, and it noticed he was still on me. I crossed an empty parking lot, and I felt like he'd gotten closer, and he had. He was speeding up and was coming in hot until I pretended to reach into my pocket for a knife, and then as soon as I made that motion, he made an impressively quick sharp turn and sped off in the other direction. Again, it's not the creepiest thing, but it's still one of the more strange things that I've had happen. I couldn't tell you what his motive was. I had no idea if he wanted to jump me or rob me, not a clue. This second encounter is a bit more unsettling. I was walking home from what my job was at that time. I worked at a Wendy's around the corner from my house, and I just finished my first closing shift. I had noticed about halfway down my street there was a guy just standing almost in the middle of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was someone who actually lived at a house that was about 6 houses down from mine, and he'd gotten onto his knees and started muttering random words and quotes from actors in movies. I'm pretty sure he was just on something, but he was shouting and smiling like a manic person. At one point, he ended up chasing some guy walking his dog. Right as I had looked back when I got to my front door, hands down, some of the wackiest I've experienced.